New York State sex offender registry challenged in court by a former Boy Scout leader convicted of sexually abusing boys. And because the conviction was in Canton, St. Lawrence County finds itself a defendant in a case. And the county attorney says it's a very serious case. Here's 7 News reporter Sean Brenda.
Former Boy Scout Assistant Scoutmaster Michael Kelsey is suing New York State and St. Lawrence County, saying the state's sex offender registry violates his rights.
He's challenging the constitutionality of the Sex Offender Registry Act itself, indicating that the act as constructed deprives individuals of constitutional rights.
Kelsey, convicted in 2016 of sexually abusing Boy Scouts at Camp Masawapi in the town of Piercefield, claims the sex offender registry infringes on his First Amendment rights, such as his right to assembly and freedom of religion. Kelsey was released from state prison in May of 2022. St. Lawrence County Attorney Stephen Bunn says with this lawsuit, Kelsey is attempting to nullify the Sex Offender Registration Act. The state describes the act as a way to protect communities by requiring sex offenders to register with the state and to provide information to a community when a sex offender moves to a neighborhood. It also requires sex offenders to avoid going near playgrounds and schools.
This could be very serious if he was ultimately able to prevail. The county does feel very strongly that we have a good position, that we can successfully defend this lawsuit, but it's going to take some time and we're going to have to work at it.
Bunn says it's still not clear if the case will continue or if it will get dismissed by the court. Also, we've learned that Kelsey allegedly violated his parole. The Dutchess County Jail says that Kelsey was brought in December 5th, and he is currently an inmate there. Sean Brenda, 7 News.